Be seated, please.
There is a question that I have to ask you about the killings. And these are homicide charges, as we all know, and that he has pled guilty to, as you know. I have to ask you that at the very moment, whether he liked the killing or not, at the very moment of his killing, with whatever disorder he had, as you have said it, was that present at the moment of his killing? Whatever the disorder you said it is, was that present at the moment of his killing?
The disorders that I diagnosed Mr. Dahmer as having have been present throughout his adult life,
Sure.
including the times of the killings.
Right. So that if he was unable, because of that disorder, if he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law because of a mental disease or the qualification that it meets the standard, that would have been in existence at the moment of the killings, correct? You understand my question?
No, I don't.
Okay, here's what I want to know. We know he had a mental disorder. You have stated it your way. Dr. Fosdale called it what he called it, Dr. Friedman, right down the line. Everybody's called it what they felt they could reason it to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, all right? I want to know if what he had, as far as you are concerned, was in existence at the moment of the killing. Is that a exact question? There's a little different flavor to it.
Go ahead.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, what I diagnosed Mr. Dahmer as having, and whatever the true diagnosis is, even if I were incorrect for some reason there, whatever diagnosis is the case with him was present at the time of the killings.
Now, I want to I'm on the downside of our discussion, so we're going to be finished as soon as I can get through some things. He seemed, during the time of his adult life, to change his fantasies, have different ones. For instance, you have testified that when he was as young as 16, in his masturbatory conduct, one of his fantasies, as I believe you have expressed it, was of a young male of the proper habitus, and the viscera, looking at the viscera of that person became part of that fantasy. Is that right?
I think that's right. There's some confusion about that point, at least in my interviews with Mr. Dahmer, and I didn't find a discussion of the point in anyone else's interviews with him.
All right, let me ask you, if you will, go to your page 4 of your report.
My report?
Yes, sir. The last sentence says, by late adolescence, thoughts of rendering a victim unconscious and of exposing the viscera were a regular, though not invariant, component of his sexual fantasies. Did I read it right?
Yes, that's right.
How, in his fantasies, was he going to expose the viscera without killing the person? Do you understand?
In the fantasies, it doesn't matter. You see, all he has to do is fantasize.
But the fantasy that he was having on the exposing of the viscera, was that person in that fantasy dead to allow him to fantasize and exposing the viscera? Do you understand my question?
I understand what you're saying, but Mr. Dahmer was never quite clear on the contents, and there's a little doubt as to whether he had the fantasy that early. At one point, he told me, yes, he did. At another point, he said, no, he didn't.
Okay.
And then he said, maybe he did, about that particular fantasy at that time.
But nonetheless, in your report, you conclude by late adolescence, thought of rendering a victim unconscious and exposing the viscera were a regular, though not invariant, component of his sexual fantasies. So at least it was discussed.
Yes.
Now, late adolescence is 16, 17?
That's what I was referring to.
You know that with Mr. Hicks, after he killed Mr. Hicks, he did in fact expose the viscera. and he did ejaculate onto the body.
Yes.
In the course of your experience as a psychiatrist dealing with everybody that you've ever dealt with, have you ever seen anyone, whatever you want to call the impairment, have you ever seen anyone do the kind of things he did to not only one human, but to a number of human beings, and I say trying to make them zombies, or ejaculating in the viscera, or laying with them and having anal sex after death and or before death and or while unconscious, or eating body parts, or exposing skulls, and all of the above? Have you ever had anybody like that?
I have had cases in which individuals eviscerated, ejaculated on the viscera, cases in which people have eaten body parts, cases in which people retain body parts, cases in which people laid with the dead body, cases in which there was an anal penetration of a dead body. And I forget what else you may have said, but I've seen other cases with every element of that.
Have you seen one case where all of those things were embodied in the same case?
I don't think any of the other cases have every single one of those elements simultaneously.
Now, let's talk, if we can, about delusions. Delusions are a false belief, no basis in reality, that a person believes for what? A period of time? Tell me, define delusion.
A delusion is a false belief resulting from a mental illness that is not susceptible to disproof with evidence. There are various kinds of delusions. Some of them are completely implausible, and those are called bizarre delusions, such as believing that one's brain has turned to cheese, or believing that one's the Emperor Napoleon. Others of them are not completely impossible, but are simply wrong, and those are considered not to be bizarre delusions.
Here's what I want to ask you. In your report, you attributed Jeffrey Dahmer to telling you that he ate body parts on 10 different victims, or 10 different occasions. Which?
10 different occasions.
Did he tell you that he was eating them because he wanted to have those people become a part of him?
He said originally it was out of curiosity and experimentation, because the other things weren't providing much satisfaction. He wanted to try something new. So he was, I would describe it as flirting with some other activity to see if it would be fulfilling. But he discovered that it did support a fantasy of being with the whole person, sometimes because he'd use photographs he'd taken, particularly in the case of Mr. Miller, to support that fantasy. And that he also came to have this sense of making the person a part of himself as well.
Delusional belief that? Is that a delusional belief that if you ate something of another person that for one moment could ever become a part of you? Would that be a delusional belief?
It's not a delusion for a couple of reasons.
It's a false belief.
Well, that's arguable, since in fact the protein is incorporated into the muscle of the person eating it. I think a lot of people are familiar with the notion that you are what you eat.
I heard that. How about the person who has a steak and feels that the steer from whence the steak came is now part of him? Would that be a false belief? I'm talking about the steer itself. I mean, you see the steer and you see it slaughtered, and then they, let's take something we all do. Not all do, but deer hunt. The hunter that comes home having shot the buck with the big horns, who then has a roast from it, says, I'm eating that to his co-workers, his co-hunters. I'm eating that because I want that buck that I shot with that big rack to be a part of me. Would that be a delusional belief?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about the altar. We have a man who has kept 10 skulls and has attempted to use epoxy glue to make some skeletons. Am I accurate so far? Did he tell you about that?
He did tell me that.
Who had an idea of this altar from whence he would sit in a chair and draw power from what he was viewing, so that amongst other things, he might make some money in real estate, become proficient in real estate. Is that a false belief?
If he were to believe that that was going to work and go about trying to convince others that it's so, and had no doubts about it, and you couldn't talk him out of it with evidence to the contrary, that could qualify. But that's not how it was.
Okay, that's understandable. I understand if that would be a delusional belief, and you said it would. What if it's just kind of a way of passing time? That is, taking 10 skulls from 10 fellas that you've dissected and just sitting there, just looking at them and remembering what they were like when they were alive and how much you enjoyed them and all of the acts that you did to cause that to happen. Would that person who was doing that be doing anything delusional, or would that be just kind of like a fellow looking at his trophies?
Would be like a hunter looking in his trophy room.
You yesterday indicated to us that this is somewhat analogous to a youngster going and getting a baseball signed by a Major League Baseball player, and then that signature makes him part. Did you say he becomes like part of the baseball player? Is that what you were telling us?
I was talking about the phenomenon of individuals wanting to incorporate someone else as part of themselves. One of the examples I used was trying to obtain artifacts of famous people, or in another time, artifacts of the saints, for example, would be used to try to have a part of something very special and keep it with oneself.
Dr. Dietz, Jeffrey Dahmer attempted homemade lobotomies. He had reported to you, as you had reported to us, that he was trying to create a sex slave, correct?
Yes.
Right. You know, as a medical doctor, do you not, that goal of his, on the basis of how he was trying to do it, was an impossibility.
That what was his, I missed one word.
Destroying the frontal lobe, the intellectual lobe, to cut off another person's will, to retain them forever as a sex slave, was not medically possible to do a homemade lobotomy, or was it?
Well, first of all, destroying someone's will with a single incision would not be an easy task.
Sure.
But a homemade lobotomy is a possible task. The effects of an actual prefrontal lobotomy wouldn't be precisely what he wanted. If he'd been able to achieve it by cutting exactly the right part or destroying it, he would have had someone whose emotions were out of control and who would laugh in a silly way at things that weren't really funny, and who would cry at the drop of a hat over things that weren't really sad, and who was terrible at making plans for the future. But it wouldn't quite destroy what he wanted to get rid of, the will.
I'm saying, is it your belief that he was successful the first time that he tried that? There wouldn't have been any of these other murders that create an ad zombie? Do you really believe that when he told you that fact, that if he had, that's what he wanted, and if he had been able to achieve it, would have been all over it, no more murders? Did you believe that?
Not exactly. I think the attraction of that particular partner would have worn off. Sure. Because he's not a person whose character is such that a monogamous single relationship was likely to work, any more than a man who finally manages to sexually have contact with a woman who's attractive to him will necessarily be satisfied with that one permanently.
But we heard they were one of his choices. So when he is reporting what his choices are to you, you're not necessarily believing that would have been the final thing anyway, correct?
That's right. I don't think we can tell from his hierarchy that if he could have had it this way, he'd never have done anything else.
In other words, when he said to you, listen, when I went to these bathhouses, I had to put these people unconscious. And the only reason I put them unconscious is they wanted to do anal sex, and I didn't want that. I want them to do it to me. So this way I had control over them, and I was the one calling the shots as to what was going to be done. Yeah, that's one of the things he reported to you.
Yes, that, and of course the control over how long they'd spend with him.
Okay, now, if Jeffrey Dahmer, the very first time he went to a bathhouse, had decided that he didn't mind that kind of activity, the kind of activity I just described, it was okay with him. Is it your opinion that we wouldn't have been talking about him later rendering people unconscious? Or would that still have happened? Understand my question?
I understand what you're saying, but the answer depends largely on what choices he were to make. Because at all times, he could have chosen not to indulge those of his fantasies that harmed other people or that were criminal or that required taking such measures as he did.
So what I think I'm hearing you saying is that at all times, at any time, down this killing road that he was on, I'm going to hold it up here to make sure that it is. The other so that all times on this killing road, and if you can't see it, at all times on this killing road, Jeffrey Dahmer could have gotten up one morning and said, "That's it, I'm done." He had the ability to do that. Is that what you tell us?
Certainly.
Okay. Had he chosen to continue on in the same course of conduct as the evidence in July and in June and in May and in April, if he chose after Tracy Edwards to say, "I'm not going to stop," we could have expected a rise in pretty much the same line, but with his mindset as it was going up the line, drinking the same amount. True?
If he drank the same amount, had the same apartment, same amount of money, hadn't gotten caught, managed to keep the disposal outflow as high as the intake, then he would have continued, I think.
And it is your professional opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty that he could have stopped any time. Just got up and said, "My willpower says stop." That the recurrent intense sexual urges of his paraphilic disorder were not so severe that he could have stopped without more than willpower. His willpower was strong enough to say stop.
Well, the urges are no more severe than anyone else's sexual urges. It's a matter of deciding how one will fulfill them. At other times, he decided to fulfill them in lawful ways. At these times, he did not.
If I understand what you're saying is that no person's sexual urges can ever become so strong that they can't say stop.
I object to that. This is referring to this particular man, not speculative.
I'm not talking about Dr. Dietz's sexual urges. Talking about a person.
Dahmer.
You indicated, to withdraw the question, you indicated that Dahmer could stop at any time because his sexual urges were no different than anyone else's sexual urges. Is that what you said?
Well, I indicated that with respect to sexual urges, the intensity of his sexual urges is no different from the intensity of normal sexual urges. But mind you, sexual urges aren't why he was killing. He didn't have sexual urges to be killing. So it's a little misleading to be talking about the intensity of sexual urges.
Why was he trying to create a zombie? For what purpose?
In order to be able to have handy someone to use for sexual purposes.
Why was he killing?
In some instances, to avoid a confrontation that would follow in the morning. In some instances, in one instance, because he had to destroy the evidence of the brain-damaged young man that he'd been seen with by the police and others. And in general, because he wanted to spend more time enjoying sexual activity with these individuals.
How about then his attempts to alter the killing by using the mannequin and going to the graveyard? How does that fit into this program of his sexual urges?
The mannequin was an effort to find a stimulus to his fantasies that would be useful for a time. In fact, was for 2 weeks. He enjoyed masturbating to this mannequin of a male that he'd stolen from a shopping center, and which was clothed. And that was successful, just as looking at videotapes had been successful and looking at photographs had been successful and fantasy alone had been successful. But his grandmother found the mannequin and he got rid of it. But it was successful. That is, he was able with any of those stimuli to masturbate and have an orgasm, which relieves sex drive until it's time for the next urge. And in the same way that he had done that, he thought perhaps he would try to find a fresh corpse through going to the funerals in the cemetery. And so I have no doubt that had he been able to obtain that corpse, that he would have found that useful and enjoyable too.
Doctor, do you believe that Mr. Flowers would have been a victim had his grandmother not walked in on the foray, on the two of them together? You know who I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. I think so, yes.
Do you think that the youngster that was able to get out, the one he hit over the head with the mallet, would have been dead had he had him unconscious from the striking on the mallet?
Yes.
Yeah. You treat paraphilias?
I haven't for years now.
How long was the last time you treated paraphilia?
Well, since I stopped doing any treatment and started doing forensic psychiatry. And that was about 1982 when I stopped doing treatment.
How about necrophilics? Have you treated any of them? Ever?
No, I don't think we had any at Hopkins or at Bridgewater.
One of the things that you wrote about forensic psychiatrists is that neither the legal system nor society needs forensic psychiatrists who believe that an ability to testify qualifies them to answer any question. They need true experts in criminal behavior, mental disability, forensic child psychiatry, or legal aspects of psychiatric practice. And that is a statement that you made, and you're obviously committed to that. That sounds like what you should say. I want to ask you, is not one, when they start discussing this compulsion about a person's given sexual disorder, is not a person who treats those people on a daily basis, whether they be 1 or 50, isn't that a person who can become an expert in the mental disability of the paraphilia that they're teaching, that they're treating? Wouldn't you agree with that?
Of course.
Sure. And if those people say based upon my experience as a clinical psychiatrist, psychologist who is treating these paraphilics day in and day out, that I believe that the sickness that they have, forget about what the legal system calls it, but the sickness that they have becomes so overwhelming that they will not be able to stop it by willpower alone. Aren't they to be given some credence?
Well, I respect Dr. Berlin's opinion on this, but so far, I believe he's been unable to convince any of the rest of us who have experience in criminal behavior, and we await some showing of convincing evidence that that's the case.
Well, but you have been on the docket since 1985 of saying that no sexual disorder can ever be in and of itself a mental disease under the legal system, correct?
Sure, and so is almost everyone else in my field. Dr. Berlin is the only person I've ever heard of suggesting that someone could be legally insane because of a paraphilia alone until this case.
Did you hear Dr. Becker's testimony?
No, I've never heard her testify on any sanity issue.
Did you hear Dr. Wallstrom's testimony?
No, I didn't.
Okay. So what you're saying is, if I heard you, that you have to be convinced, because right now, nobody's been able to convince you that a person suffering from a paraphilia can't stop that behavior by willpower alone. Right?
I think my entire profession needs to be convinced.
Things change, don't they, doctor?
They do. There was a century ago when people thought that some paraphiles were insane, and in this century, we've learned that that doesn't seem possible. And now Dr. Berlin wants to push the clock back, but it's a different view.
The case is not Dietz versus Berlin. You're entitled to your opinion. It's up to the jury to weigh, correct?
It is for the jury to make a decision.
And we don't have any other psychiatrists who you're quoting are coming into the courtroom after you. So I have a chance to get out of them their reasons for feeling the way you do. True?
I don't know what your plans are.
Well, but there's no other, these other psychiatrists in the profession don't agree, except Dr. Berlin and you are in opposite poles. I mean, this right now is just my asking you your opinion, correct? I'm not asking you about what the opinion of these unknown, at least unknown to me, psychiatrists are. So I want to ask you this. Have you changed your opinion at any time in the last 10 years, reference any type of mental disorder by classifying it as something greater than it was at the time it was reviewed? Have you done that?
I don't quite understand.
All right, let me ask you a question. Didn't DSM-3R take paraphilias out of sexual disorders and sexual deviations? Didn't they move it into a different category by itself?
I hadn't noticed. If we did, I thought it was still in with sexual disorders.
But wasn't it at one time called sexual deviations?
Oh, all the paraphilias were at one time called sexual deviations.
Are they now?
DSM-3R now uses the term paraphilias.
Why?
Because a lot of people thought sexual deviations included homosexuality, and Dr. Money, who was on the DSM-3 committee, wanted to reintroduce the term paraphilia, which Wilhelm Stekel had urged be used back in the 20s, in turn of the century.
25 years ago, was there a mental disability known as Alzheimer's disease?
Yes.
What was it called?
At that time?
Yeah.
25 years ago, I think most people would talk about it as senile dementia and lump a whole group of different conditions together there.
That's right. And then through study, those in your field started recognizing that it's not just hardening of the arteries or old age. It is a condition, and it was called Alzheimer's. So there was a change in that, was there not?
It was a recognition that Alzheimer's was one cause of the syndrome that used to be lumped together, and there was an increased knowledge.
What did they call anorexia 25 years ago?
25 years ago, I think probably most anorectics would have either been called models or hysterics.
Is that a mental disease?
Anorexia nervosa?
Yeah. Is it?
Again, mental disease isn't a medical term, but it's certainly a mental disorder.
How severe?
Life-threatening.
Is it as severe as schizophrenia?
In a different dimension.
Sure.
Schizophrenia is far more severe in what it does to mental processes, but less likely to pose an immediate threat to life.
So anorexia, of course, you folks, with the more you've studied, have come to understand more about it, and you have been able to find ways of understanding it and treating it, right?
People in my field have, yes.
And bulimia is the same. It's life-threatening, is it not?
Yes.
It was unheard of 25 years ago, wasn't it?
No, but it was certainly not a commonly known term, and I think only people with very specialized knowledge had even heard of it.
I guess the reason is that 25 years from now, let's hope we never have another new subcategory, that there are 50 more Jeffrey Dahmers that come down the pike. We probably might learn more about the kind of disease or the kind of disorder he has, correct?
I'm sure we'll continue to learn more about the paraphilias.
And also the necrophilias.
The necrophilia in particular.
Okay. Now, the business of compulsion. The cognitive and the volitional. The cognitive goes to the appreciation of right from wrong. The volitional goes to the ability to conform your conduct, right?
Yes.
Is not compulsion an act of the will as opposed to the act of the intellect?
The medical concept of compulsion that I specifically delineated would deal with the will.
Okay, so therefore, if I have a compulsion to do something, and I say, in order for me to do that compulsion, that thing that I want so bad, I have to do A, B, and C. I have to get in my car, I have to drive to the liquor store, and I have to purchase the bottle because I want a drink. Or the anorexic young lady or bulimic young lady, same kind of example. The planning of that is an intellectual exercise, not a volitional exercise, correct?
Well, you're not describing a medical compulsion now. You're describing what would be described in ordinary language as a compulsion to go drink. And yes, it's true that the planning and activities that go into that are part of the intellectual exercise.
Okay. But I guess what I'm trying to say then is when you tell us about all the planning that he was doing, that was part of his cognitive function, was it not?
Making plans in advance and thinking them through are evidence of cognitive functioning. But in addition, executing a plan, taking steps deliberately, delaying gratification, and acting according to a timetable that suits one's interests may reflect great volitional control as well.
Told us about riding around in squad cars with the LA Police Department going to these places on the west side of Hollywood. And and I want to ask you about that. A man wants to watch that or engage in it. He desires it. It is recurring thought processes to get involved in that. It becomes something that he really wants to do, and in a non-medical way, it becomes a compulsion. Although he knows it's wrong. He knows it's wrong. At least let's say his moral conscience says, I shouldn't be doing this. His going there and viewing it and paying the ticket and making sure that he isn't followed and making sure that his wife is out of town are all acts of his intellect. True?
They all reflect his intellect, his ability to delay doing this until his wife is out of town, until he's alone at this place, are an example of his capacity to conform his conduct. If he couldn't conform his conduct, he'd jump on the nearest attractive person.
My understanding then of what you say, that unless you saw him doing everything helter-skelter, no, strike that. Even if he did everything helter-skelter, by that I mean without any plan, just doing it whenever, today, tomorrow, yesterday, no fixed way of doing it, no plan, no pre-plan, and all he had medically or psychiatrically was a paraphilia, either partialism, frauderism, or necrophilia, he would still not be suffering from a mental disease as defined to you by the district attorney and is redefined by me. It would not be such an impairment of the mind that would affect his mental or emotional processes to such a degree that he would lack the substantial capacity to conform that conduct to requirements of law. True?
I don't mean to ask you to repeat that, but the first part of the question was to assume that the paraphilia
is
what?
The ones you said, partialism,
Yes.
frauderism, and necrophilia. That's all he has. And he does everything helter-skelter. Would your opinion be different? If that's all he has, would your opinion as to whether or not he was suffering from a mental disease is defined 5 or 6 times now in the last day and a half, would your opinion be any different than the one that you've delineated?
I don't think that an individual would be doing everything helter-skelter unless there were another mental disorder. If you mean merely a disorganized and sloppy person, now that obviously doesn't require a mental disease.
Okay.
But if you mean no planning at all, probably doesn't occur without something being wrong.
Minimal planning. Only night, never at the same place, hits people over the head with different objects, different times of the night, different places in town, in and out, does it, and goes about his business. That's the kind of helter-skelter. Would that change your opinion if his mental condition was as you have told us?
If that were the behavior, I'd expect to find some abnormalities of the brain to account for his being that impulsive, and those could change my behavior.
Abnormalities of the brain of a physiological nature or a psychiatric nature?
Both.
Well, are you suggesting that then if there was some abnormality of the brain that was discernible in Mr. Dahmer and he did everything that he has done here that we know about, that your opinion might be different than it is?
If there were some discernible abnormality of his brain, but all of his behaviors were the same, that wouldn't change my ultimate opinion, because my opinion's based on his behaviors at the time of the crime, including his statements about his mental state at the time of the crime. And as long as he, in fact, had all of the evidence that I've described of appreciating that it was wrong and of being able to conform his conduct, then my opinion would remain the same regardless of what other diagnoses there may be.
We've talked, or you've told us about psychiatric term of compulsion. What's the psychiatric term of obsession when you're obsessed with something? What's the distinction between obsession and compulsion?
An obsession has to do with an idea, a cognition, actually. And an obsession must be an idea that is recognized by the individual as foreign and alien and unwelcome. It has to be seen as intruding itself into the person's mind when they don't want it there, as something that they would rather not have in their mind, as something they regard as senseless to think about, and as something they want to get rid of as a thought.
Doctor, you have taught at the FBI crime laboratory or the behavioral science laboratory?
I've taught at the FBI Academy and at a number of FBI schools around the country. Specifically, my relationship there is with the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime at the FBI Academy.
And you have been involved as a testifier in the case of U.S. versus Hinckley?
Yes.
You were hired by the government in that case and testified on behalf of the government.
That's right.
One of the things that you said in that, in your testimony, not one of the things, you said a lot of things, but you talked about choices of Mr. Hinckley as evidencing his lack of mental disorder, such as he wouldn't have shot the president if it was raining outside. Am I right? Did you say that? That would have been a choice. I would not do it if it was raining outside. You used that kind of thing in that case, correct?
I don't remember that particular example, but if he said that to me, I would have quoted him.
Well, I think I may be wrong, but you also said, you know, that when you are in a position where you are making choices, unless you are psychotic, well, I'll strike that because I'm trying to get to what you say. There were psychiatrists that disagreed with you in that case, were there not?
Yes, there were.
All right. The other notable case was you were a consultant to the FBI in trying to the Tylenol murder cases in Chicago.
Yes, I played a small part in that.
Okay. You were a consultant to the district attorney for the People versus Robert Chambers.
Yes, known as the Preppy murder case.
The Preppy murder case, and that did you testify in that?
No, I was on call to testify and just consulted.
Sure. You're a consultant to the Office of the Attorney General of the State of New York in grand jury investigation into the Miss Tawana Brawley matter.
Yes.
You're a consultant to the CIA in a case. This I'm reading off your dossier.
Yes, there was a lawsuit against them for alleged brainwashing activities in Canada some years ago.
But you're hired by the federal government.
Correct.
You're a consultant to the District Attorney of Monroe County, New York, in a People versus Shawcross case.
That's right.
Did you testify in that case?
Yes.
On behalf of the state, I trust.
That's right.
You're a consultant to the U.S. Department of Justice in the case of U.S. versus Moody.
Correct.
You testified on behalf of the Department of Justice.
That's right.
The only one I see, at least the notable cases you put down where it would appear on the face that you weren't testifying on behalf of the government, is the People versus Bardo case.
Of the ones I have listed there, that's true. Much of the time when I'm consulting on behalf of the defense, I'm not free to reveal that relationship, and so couldn't list it in the CV.
Were you able to give your opinion in the Bardo case?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you have been in a position where you would advise the FBI, their behavioral science unit, as to the kind of person they might go out about looking for if in this crime scene analysis business?
From time to time, that has been one of the questions that's been asked of me, though I'm principally asked to consult on matters where the issue is somewhat different than which person committed the crime.
You in any way troubled by the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer was getting so, I don't even know what word to use. He was taking showers with 2 dead bodies in the bathtub that had water and some disinfectant, and leaving that out so he could take a shower and then refilling up the bathtub. That didn't. What did that mean to you?
Well, I think it requires an extraordinary degree of desensitization to be able to do that and not be troubled by it. I think that it's likely that he was drinking very heavily at that time to be able to do that. I think that's the most likely explanation for doing something that weird.
Let me get to this drinking business. Where is the evidence that he, other than his own words, was this excessive drinker? Did you get any information that when he was arrested that he was drunk?
The
police reports? Was he intoxicated when he was arrested?
May I answer the first question?
Sure, either way.
Yeah, the evidence that Mr. Dahmer was an excessive drinker began, other than his own reports, and his own reports have said he was an excessive drinker since high school. He said that every time he's been arrested for each of the offenses he's been arrested for. He said it every time he's been in any trouble. He said it repeatedly to those who've counseled him, put him on his probation officer, those who've examined him. All the clinicians involved in this case have been told by Mr. Dahmer that he's an excessive drinker. But in addition to that, which reflects his statements largely, Jeff Six reported that Mr. Dahmer would drink often their senior year in school, that they drank to get drunk and until their noses would get numb. Jeff Six,
you're reading a police report?
That came from a police interview of Jeff Six.
All right.
Then in 1977 to 78, Dahmer and Jeff Six really hung out together, according to Six. They drank beer before football games and went late so as not to pay admission. Six said that Dahmer did drink a lot, but people didn't see it because he'd drink by himself in bathrooms. He'd be intoxicated, but he wouldn't brag about it. He kept his drinking low profile. Then a police report from September 17, 1978, the Ohio State University Police recorded thefts of a watch, a radio, and cash from 3 roommates in room 541 of the Ross house on particular dates. And about 6 weeks later, Mr. Dahmer was recorded by the police reports there as being a possible suspect in the thefts. The reasons that the roommate suspected Dahmer was that he'd had a drinking problem, which required money. In October of 1978, the Ohio State University police records noted that Mr. Dahmer lived in room 541 at Ross House and wrote, quote, Mr. Dahmer has an alcohol problem. He drinks between 3 and 4 quarts of liquor per day. He has been responsible for many acts of destruction. Then a roommate of Mr. Dahmer's at Ohio State, Michael Prochaska.
What year are you talking about?
1978.
Okay.
Said that in the fall quarter of that year, when they shared a bedroom, his watch had been stolen. His friend Mike's radio had been stolen. Dahmer was suspected because he was the only one present during the theft. He said that Mr. Dahmer drank a lot and took liquor bottles and wine to class, that Mr. Dahmer tape recorded lectures and returned to the room to listen to the tape while he got drunk. He drank a couple of fifths a day. He slept in a top bunk and always had trouble getting into bed. And Mr. Prochaska thought that Dahmer was an alcoholic. On one occasion, Mr. Dahmer damaged a bathroom tiled wall by kicking it, which was witnessed by another roommate, Dave Stillwell. Also, Mr. Prochaska said that Dahmer often donated blood for money to buy alcohol. And in fact, that the 3 plasma banks on campus had begun to mark Mr. Dahmer's fingernails so that he could not donate more than once a week. Also, he quoted Mr. Dahmer as saying he had a letter written by a congressman that he used to be able to buy alcohol from liquor stores, even though he was underage. And finally, according to this witness, during the last 2 weeks of the fall quarter, Mr. Dahmer saved his liquor bottles and lined them up on his desk. And there were, as a result, 32 liquor bottles there when his parents came to pick him up.
That 1978?
That was 78.
Okay.
Next is 1980 in the Army. The Army records indicate that on May 10, 1980, an Article 15 was filed because it was reported that Mr. Dahmer having knowledge of a verbal lawful order issued by a ranking officer in Baumholder, Germany, had wrongfully failed to obey the same by having hard liquor in his billets. And it was alleged also that he was drunk and disorderly in his quarters. As a consequence of that, Article 15, he was reduced to the grade of E14, suspended for a time, forfeited $100 for 2 months, and got 15 extra days of duty. In August of 1980, Mr. Dahmer was, according to military records, counseled on an incident that occurred August 2nd when he was picked up by the military police for being under the influence of alcohol. On December 8 of 1980, Mr. Dahmer arrived for work 45 minutes late, so intoxicated that he couldn't stand up, according to military records. On December 22, 1980, Mr. Dahmer was drunk and disorderly during the previous weekend. On December 22 of 1980, he arrived on duty heavily intoxicated. On December 23rd, 1980, he was counseled because he failed to perform a duty that was assigned to him and was again intoxicated at the time he was counseled. On 3/7/81, still from military records, Mr. Dahmer reported for formation in an improper uniform and was sent back to his room to get in proper uniform. He didn't report back. His area was in a shambles, and he was found there intoxicated. On March 9th of 81, Mr. Dahmer was found to be drinking on duty in the Army, and as a result of that, the commander revoked his access to classified material and discharged him from the Army with an honorable discharge. In 1981, October 1981, records from the Bath Township, Ohio Police Department indicate that Mr. Dahmer was arrested at 8:36 in the evening for disorderly conduct in an incident in which he was intoxicated, drinking from an open container of vodka and making a scene at the Ramada Inn Hotel, which asked him to leave. He refused. When the police arrived, he was resistant with the police, and they patted him down and handcuffed him, told him to get in the patrol car, and then there was a verbal and perhaps physical altercation between Mr. Dahmer and the police officers, during the course of which he was injured, and that was written up as having fallen out of a chair because he was intoxicated. In the period from the time Mr. Dahmer came to Milwaukee until the time of his arrest, he had, on these charges, he was working primarily at 2 jobs for which I have records, the plasma center and the chocolate factory. In both of those capacities, he was eventually terminated for excessive absenteeism and tardiness. And although alcoholism is not the only cause of excessive absenteeism and tardiness, industrial consultants have for many years now used absenteeism and tardiness as one of the best indicators of the rates of alcoholism in the labor force. And it's likely because of that correlation that Mr. Dahmer's excessive absenteeism and tardiness at the times he wasn't committing crimes may be related to his excessive drinking. The dates of his absences at work do not always correspond to the killings. And so there are other occasions when alcoholism may play a role. Of course, Dr. Rosen, who treated him or attempted to, diagnosed him as an alcoholic. The court that sentenced Mr. Dahmer in January of 1989 mandated inpatient or outpatient alcoholism treatment for him. There was an incident that would be difficult to otherwise explain around Thanksgiving of 1989 when Mr. Dahmer was on a work release, was on a pass for Thanksgiving Day from the House of Corrections. When he returned from the House of Corrections, obviously intoxicated, and was written up for an infraction for that. And there are several accounts of what happened there. But only his story describes what happened while he was gone, which is that he was drinking very heavily, became intoxicated, and during an alcoholic blackout, submitted himself to be bound by another man and regained memory at a time when he was restrained and being sexually tortured by the man. But he returned intoxicated. In May of 1990, Mr. Dahmer entered treatment for alcoholism at DePaul Hospital's outpatient program. And in the course of that, there was reported a family history of alcoholism in his maternal grandfather. So that information probably came from him. Both at the time of his intake at DePaul and at the time of discharge in December 1990, when he stopped going to the outpatient sessions, he was given a principal diagnosis of alcohol dependence. So I think that although the latter part of that depends in part on Mr. Dahmer's statements, the evidence is persuasive enough to me to make the diagnosis of his having an alcohol problem that I called alcohol dependency.
Now, you not only call it alcohol dependency, but you call it mild or moderate.
That's right.
Well, that would seem to imply that it wasn't so severe that, well, let me ask this way. Is someone who has mild or moderate alcohol dependence, should they go into for treatment? Mild or moderate?
Well, from the standpoint of what would be best for the individual, everyone with alcohol dependence would be better off without it, and some kind of treatment would be useful to them.
Well, let me see if I can't, because I'm almost finished. No one at work ever reported him being drunk on the job. Is that correct?
That's right.
The cops that were there on the SS incident, when they arrested him at work, they didn't find him in a state of intoxication, did they? They went to work. I mean, I'm not trying to mislead you. They went to work, but they didn't find that he had been intoxicated, did they?
I don't recall the police reports at the time of his arrests
How about
mentioning that he was intoxicated for any of the crimes.
How about the night Tracy Edwards escaped? Was he intoxicated according to the police?
I didn't see anything mentioned about intoxication in the police report.
How about the police that took the confession from him when he started confessing? They didn't find him being in a state of intoxication, did they?
I didn't see an indication in the police reports of that.
How about the officers that were with him on the Conrack Sitzman-Sohn situation? They reported he had been drinking. They didn't say he was intoxicated, did they?
That's right.
How about the people in the apartment building? Did they see this man walking around impaired from alcohol?
No.
A person with a mild or moderate alcohol dependence don't necessarily drink every day, do they?
No, they do not.
And do they always, when they drink themselves into a state of intoxication?
No.
Just a few things in closing, I believe, doctors, because when I sit down, that's it. I want to ask you about your agreement with the district attorney's office. You were unable to get here to prepare whatever you had to do by the 7th. You needed a few extra days. Is that right?
My recollection is that I expressed to Mr. McCann the view that I would welcome extra days.
Okay.
I think it was possible to do it if I had to, but it was going to require more than one all-nighter, and I'd rather avoid it.
First day you were here was what day?
I think it was January 6th.
6th. All right. Now, in that regard, you spent a total of 3 days, 18 hours total time with
I think it was about 18 hours, yes, over 3 days.
What was your agreement relative to compensation?
I was told that I would be paid by the county at my customary fees for government work, which is a lower fee than for private work.
Which is lower than private?
Lower than private, yes. Up to a limit of what eventually became a limit of 13 days that would be approved for compensation.
Well, give us a number. What's your rate?
My rate is $3,000 a day.
$3,000 a day?
That's correct.
And how much is that an hour?
$300 an hour.
So you have how many days in? What's your total bill up to now as you sit here?
Well, my bill's going to be all of that because the budget ran out before I came here to testify.
The budget was what? How much?
The total amount that I'd be authorized to bill for fees would be $39,000.
And you are going to charge more than $39,000?
No, I'm not. I'm doing my testimony without compensation because I agreed to do the case for a fixed amount.
And the fixed amount now is $39,000?
Yes.
So that's what you're going to be paid, $39,000?
I expect so, yes.
I just want to check with our people and see if they're doing it or not. Thank you, Dr. Dietz.
Doctor, you've been questioned on cross-examination as to whether, as paraphilia alone, could it constitute such a disease or disorder as to relieve a person of criminal responsibility? And you've talked about that. And basically, your position is that it could not. Is that correct? Paraphilia alone, having a paraphilia alone, whether one calls it a disease or a disorder, would not be such as to constitute cause for relieving a person of criminal responsibility.
That's correct, a paraphilia alone, except when one concocts the most unusual sorts of examples. Someone, because of a paraphilia, might be engaging in an activity which they wouldn't be engaging in otherwise, and coincidentally, during that, do something unlawful and unrelated to the paraphilia. There might be some way to fancifully construct a scenario, but for all practical purposes, I can't imagine a paraphilia alone serving as a basis for lacking criminal responsibility for a crime related to sexual activity.
And that is, in fact, consistent with the great body of psychiatric thinking, forensic psychiatric thinking. Is that not true?
That is true.
And the only person you know of, the only forensic psychiatrist that takes a different position is Dr. Fred Berlin. Is that correct?
The only person I was aware of who had experience evaluating criminal defendants and considering any issue of sanity who had ever taken that position, to my knowledge, was Dr. Berlin, at least in the last 30 years.
And did you know that this was the first time he ever advanced that theory in a murder case?
I've heard that, yes.
And that Dr. Becker, who is a psychologist, advanced the same theory. She has never testified before in any case of any type. Were you aware that she had that same perception as Dr. Berlin?
I've been told that, yes.
So they're thinking, at least as far, may I ask this? Can you think of, in the cases you reviewed, your work as a forensic psychiatrist, can you think of any other murder case where the issue advanced as a defense was only a paraphilia or several paraphilias, when the issue was criminal responsibility?
No.
With respect to the mental disease issue, I read to you and the jury heard it yesterday afternoon. I put the same question 15 times, and it read this way. Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed James Dockstader was the first thing. You listed issues bearing on cognition, and you listed issues bearing on conforming. And then I asked you, and what did you conclude? And you responded. For the first 13, there was no discussion by you or by me of mental disease, was there?
I believe there was not.
I didn't put it in my question, and you didn't put it in your answer. Let me ask this. Considering you based your opinions, is it not clear, on your examinations, your extensive 18-hour examinations of the defendant, Mr. Dahmer, the voluminous records that you obviously have very carefully gone over, those were the bases for your opinion. Is that correct?
My opinions are based on everything I know.
And does it alter it at all? Does your opinion change at all? We'll speak about the last two counts later. Does your opinion change at all about what you said on mental responsibility, legal responsibility? Does it change at all whether or not we call the paraphilias a mental disease or we say it's not a mental disease? Does that change your opinion at all?
It doesn't change my opinion on whether he appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct or whether he could conform his conduct, because my opinion on those issues isn't based on a consideration of diagnosis or what may be wrong with him, but rather on evidence concerning the behavior at the time of the crimes, insofar as it can be read from the kinds of evidence I've been relying on, including Mr. Dahmer's statements.
With respect to the last two counts, because the alcohol situation had changed slightly, or changed some, you pointed that out. But just to make it clear to the jury, with respect to the last two counts, keeping in mind the observations you made, the records you reviewed, and so on, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether or not Mr. Dahmer, at the time of the commission of the deaths of Oliver Lacey and Joseph Bradehoff, had the capacity substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
That he did.
Now, with respect to the issue of Mr. Edwards, Tracy Edwards, you were provided, as part of the material sent from my office, you were provided a police report with respect to the statement of Tracy Edwards on the morning that Mr. Dahmer was arrested. Is that correct?
Yes.
You've looked at a lot of police reports in your career, have you not? I mean, many hundreds, maybe thousands. Is that true?
Yes, it is.
Would it be safe to say that that was a 6-page, typed, double-spaced interview report of Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Did it look to you like a sloppy, quick, rushed job as an interview of Mr. Edwards?
Not at all.
Did that interview contain any statement about Dahmer rocking and chanting the morning in the experience that Mr. Edwards had with him?
No, it didn't.
And you've come in your experience when people appear on the Geraldo show and on the Donahue show, you've come to have a more reserved perception of their reliability after that. Would that be accurate?
Depending on what the topic is and what's happened there, I've come to think that it can alter one's recollections and how one tells a story.
In terms of the increase in the number of homicides over a particular period of time, in your review of serial killings, is that rather typical that as a serial killer develops the skill, desensitizes himself, sets up the right situation, that the number of serial killings tends to rise over a given framework of time?
Yes.
And is that consistent with your observations of Mr. Dahmer?
Yes, it is.
And in terms of, can one conclude, looking at that fact alone, can one conclude that the individual must be sane or insane from looking at that issue?
No one can conclude that the individual must be a serial killer.
And the fact that a person can continue to get away with it and use cunning to do it and planning to do it is all consistent with in terms of responsibility for it. Would that be accurate?
Yes, it is.
You've testified that the paraphilia of the defendant did not include killing. Is that correct?
That's right.
And we've talked about, and that in fact, every doctor has been consistent in saying that he did not draw pleasure in that killing. Is that correct as far as you know?
As far as I know, it is.
Was the defendant, the sexual desire of the defendant had, that sexual desire was not for killing, was it?
Correct, it was not.
And the information that you have available to you was that indeed he, even after turning away after the Tuomi incident, where he seemed to embrace what he was doing, that even when he undertook to kill, he would still feel some inhibitions. Is that correct?
I think we've got a little too far in the leading prop, so I'm going to check.
That even after the Tuomi incident, when he decided that he made certain decisions we talked about. Is that correct?
Yes.
And even after that, he still felt inhibitions at the time he undertook to commit the murders. Is that correct? At least in some of the cases he said that.
Yes, he said he needed to overcome the inhibitions with alcohol.
With respect to the delusions, alleged delusions, particularly weighting with the skulls and so on, are you aware that both Dr. Becker and Dr. Berlin considered that in terms of whether or not he was psychotic or whether it was delusional, and determined that he was not psychotic and this was not delusional thinking? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
That apparently only one psychiatrist, Dr. Wallstrom, took that position. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Are you aware that neither of the court-appointed experts took the position that he was delusional?
That's my understanding.
Are you aware that Dr. Fosdal did not take the position, who also discussed the temple, that indicated delusional thinking?
I am aware of that.
With respect to the undertaking of work with the zombie, the frontal lobe operation, would it be safe to say that that was a vicious thing to do?
Well, I think now we're getting a little far afield. I was objective being leading. I'll stipulate it was vicious.
In terms, did you, from your discussions with the defendant, perform any perception of what value he put on human life?
I don't think I have any basis for an expert opinion on that. I think the facts speak for themselves.
In other words, what he did speaks louder than anything he would have said. Is that correct?
He just said it, you don't have to, yeah. Bet you it's.
So you just cite the, fine. With respect to Conorak, synthesymphone, are you aware that, I don't know if you are or not, that the police officer, Balcerzak, testified that he turned to the crowd, he said that described the location of the people, and said out to the crowd, "Does anyone know this man?" In speaking of Conorak synthesymphone, and that no one answered that they knew him or not.
I'm going to object to the part of that question.
Well, I'm asking if he was aware of that testimony or aware of that information. Are you aware of that, sir?
Yes, I think I alluded to it in my own testimony.
Are you aware that at that time, the defendant was present and would have been able to observe that no one responded, that they knew who the man was? Were you aware of that?
Yes.
So that when he returned to his dwelling, he knew that no one had recognized him, apparently, and that the only name the police had was John Hamung. Do you think that may have influenced what he did with respect to Mr. Synthesymphone, that information?
Counsel is leading, is way out of line. I'm object.
Sustained.
You were aware that he had that information at the time that he returned to the apartment?
Yes.
You've indicated that the sexual urges that he had were the same, the object was different, but were of the same level that other normal people have. Is that correct?
The object was different, but the quality of those urges is no different in the paraphilias than it is in normal individuals, who may vary in the intensity of their urges and the frequency of their urges.
In terms of the LP incident, you've indicated that you believe, as I recollect, you believe that Flowers would have been slain had the grandmother not been there. What was your opinion with respect to the LP incident? Did you form an opinion on that, whether the defendant would have proceeded to slay him or not, if you did form an opinion? I'm sorry, you did, the LP incident, I'm sorry. Counsel did not touch, I believe, well, you did on the LP incident, did not touch on the Somsac synthism phone incident. Well, you did not.
I did not on LP.
I will not touch on it. Right, I will not touch on it. Again, in terms of the word compulsion that comes up again, you have repeatedly said, correct me if I'm wrong, that is a sexual urge that is being discussed when the defendant uses that term compulsion. Would that be accurate?
Every time Mr. Dahmer used the word compulsion in police reports or in things quoted in police reports or the psychiatric exams, I believe he was referring to his sexual urges. I don't think he ever used that term to refer to his desire to drink or to anything else. And I don't think he has ever had any of the behaviors that medically would be considered a compulsion.
So he's not had medically what would be considered a compulsion. And in the terms of the desires you know from the paraphilia, those desires would be sexual desires. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Are you familiar with some of the writings of Seymour Halleck, psychiatrist?
Yes, I am.
And he is a respected forensic psychiatrist. Is that correct?
Dr. Halleck's respected in psychiatry and law generally and as a general psychiatrist.
I have not put this question to you before, but are you aware whether he's written any warnings to clinicians that are working as clinicians in the field to be on the alert to being overly sympathetic to the patients that they treat or patients with whom they work?
I know that he has so warned.
In terms of alcohol, a person that is planning to get a drink, is killing a man to get a drink a part of alcoholism in terms of, let me withdraw the question. Is there a difference between an alcoholic thinking about getting a drink and an alcoholic planning to kill a man?
Of course.
And this defendant's paraphilia does not have to do with killing people. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Thank you, Doctor. No, I just one additional question. Just so the jury understands, when you say you've exhausted the budget, you've put in more hours and you're not getting paid for it. Is that correct?
That's true.
And due to professional commitment, despite that, you continued to prepare for this case and to appear here. Is that true?
Yes.
Knowing you wouldn't be compensated for the extra work.
Right.
Thank you.
I have no question.
You may step down, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Any further witnesses for this state?
None, Your Honor. The state reps.
Mr. Boyle, any rebuttal testimony?
No rebuttal testimony. I'll have a statement for the record outside the presence of the jury at an appropriate time.
Okay.
And make sure that all our exhibits are known.
I wanted to reserve that too.
We can do that.
Okay. Jury is excused. Be seated, please.
Your Honor, I have a statement to make for the record.
I think I need that door closed. I have always keeping in mind that matters are reviewed and people ask questions as to the why did you do this and the why didn't you do that. I think it's necessary for me to tell the court that at some juncture, while I was preparing this case, I thought very hard and long about calling Mr. Dahmer to the witness stand. I talked to him about it on a number of occasions. It was going to be his decision, not mine. my experience as a lawyer in these kinds of cases is I don't ever remember anyone ever calling a defendant in the second phase. I remember I tried a man who killed a Milwaukee policeman, Alvin Furtiman, but that was on the first phase. I mean, at that time it wasn't non-bifurcated, and the issue then was the same then. I mean, you got into the insanity part in the only phase before the jury. The question of calling Mr. Dahmer or not calling Mr. Dahmer was a very, very serious problem, because on the one hand, I wanted to. On the other hand, I thought that Mr. McCann's cross-examination of Mr. Dahmer would be most detrimental to Mr. Dahmer for a number of reasons. And I made some tentative decisions. Talking to my doctors, one of them incidentally said, maybe you might consider doing that. And I said, I've been thinking about it. Mr. Dahmer was never anxious to talk, never anxious to testify, but he indicated to me that he would if I asked him to and thought it was necessary. But he was kind of hoping that he wouldn't have to. It was decided that he would not. That was his decision to make, and it was only his decision to make. I might indicate to the court that in the course of my making that decision, I, as part of my work product, which is completely covered by Mr. Dahmer's privilege, did a videotape for about 33 minutes talking about things other than the case, talking about, sports and activities of that nature. And I'm of the opinion that, and I had his permission to use that to find out whether or not the perception would be positive or negative, how he might be seen. And I did that because I really thought that this was probably the most important decision I'd have to make in the case. And I've told Mr. Dahmer, and I've said it on the tape itself, that it remains with me and no one else, unless otherwise changed by Mr. Dahmer in the future. I had his permission, and that likewise is on that tape, which I have in my possession, to have a couple of, to use my own discretion on the viewing of it, to help me make what I considered to be a problematical decision. When all is said and done, Your Honor, Mr. Dahmer decided that he did not want to testify. I still had that avenue open, even in rebuttal, if I chose to suggest to Mr. Dahmer that he change his opinion and exercise. And I think it's very necessary for me to put this on the record so that someone someday might say that Mr. Dahmer could have helped himself by testifying, or so often today us lawyers are so concerned about second guessers that we have to somehow or another cover ourselves to make sure we're doing the right thing. I'm certainly not doing it for that reason. I could care less about that. I'm confident in my decision, but I think I owe it to this court and to this record to make the statement I've just made, and I would ask you to make inquiry of Mr. Dahmer of whether or not he agrees with everything that I've said.
Mr. Dahmer, do you agree with what your attorney has just told the court?
Yes, I agree. With that, Your Honor, I think we all have to move in exhibits and figure out where we go from here.
Again.
The court expects.
That we do have to complete that business on the motions. I think we pretty much agreed virtually nothing will go to the jury. But I do wish to make a motion. I'm not going to tie up the court at length. I don't know whether the court wishes me to make it now or make it tomorrow morning. It will be brief. The court knows what it is, probably knows how you're going to rule on it, but it is something that I do wish to make just to preserve the record. Do you wish me to make it now, or do you wish it?
Go ahead.
All right. If it please the court, assuming that all the exhibits have been filed, I would ask the court to grant judgment in favor of the state on the basis that the defense has wholly failed to move forward with its burden of proof by the greater weight to reasonable certainty by the greater weight of credible evidence, that it could not, as a matter of law, the jury verdict could not come back in that fashion as a matter of law. That this is clearly a creative and innovative and unique type of defense. And I would urge the court, because the hour is late and I anticipate what the court's ruling will be, I would move for judgment directed verdict, the non-suit of the defendant in this case, and if the court is not inclined to rule on it at this time, at least to take it to reserve judgment on it until such time as a verdict may be returned by the jury.
I'm going to take the motion under advisement, and I'll entertain argument if it becomes necessary.
I can't even speak about the fact that it's innovative. You see, one of the problems is that I'm being accused of
Innovative defenses. I have doctors telling me what it is, and I must follow that. I don't have choices.
Well, I think we've case law that indicates it's an appropriate motion. I don't think it's innovative. Whether or not the court is about to, the court's not about to grant it, obviously.
Yes, the court knows this is not in no disparaging remark to Mr. Boyle. That is to his credit, not to.
But I would.
Judge, one final thing. I move for a directed verdict. Rules.
Motion taken under advisement. Now, what I would like to do is, first of all, we have a matter of verdicts and instructions to work out. Let's see where I'm at. Let me get the wrong. There it is. I would like to read to you what we're proposing as a special verdict, and it would be the same verdict for each of the counts. The only language that would change would be the reference to the count. Question 1 would read, at the time the crime was committed in count 1 of the information, did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? There'd be a place for an answer asking for a yes or no. Question 2. If you've answered question number 1 yes, then answer this question. As a result of the mental disease as to count 1 in the information, did the defendant lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law? And again, a place for an answer. There would be provision for dissenting jurors to indicate who they are.
Insert the name of each respective count, the name of the victim.
We could do that.
I have a serious problem
with a jury considering that in that form, because I think you should separate the wrongfulness of his conduct and have a separate yes or no to conforming conduct to the requirements of law. And I would ask that that be done because in this case, it is unique that we have never, ever supported that. And I will tell the jury that, but the fact that they're together might cause a problem with how to answer that question because an affirmative answer or a negative answer would seem to apply to both. So I would ask the court to exercise its discretion and separate them. I think you got to separate them because I think they could still say, well, I think there's enough to say you didn't know the difference between right and wrong, in spite of the fact we'll tell them that we're not even on that. But I think you have to do that, Chairman. Otherwise, we've got a confusing verdict.
That's the way the questions are framed are exactly the way they're set forth in the instructions.
I understand that, but that's because that's always an issue. I mean, I don't know, maybe the court knows better than I, where a lawyer got up and said, we're giving in on that prong. Don't consider it. But if they were to answer it yes, they would also be answering yes to that prong.
No.
They would be saying it. That's the way I look at it.
That's not the question that's presented to them.
Then let me hear the question again.
If you've answered question number 1 yes, then answer this question. As a result of the mental disease as count 1 in the information, did the defendant lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law? If either one is yes, then yes is the answer. And certainly you have the ability to explain that in your arguments.
I still would rather have them split, but since you ruled, I'll know how to handle it.
The court's going to follow the instructions as they're set forth in form instruction. Okay. As to the instructions, I'm going to tell you what I have here. And Mr. Boyle first, and then Mr. McCann can make any suggestions that you have as to additions or deletions. I have from the standard criminal instructions number 100. I then will read each count in the information. At the conclusion of that, I will make the statement that the defendant, Jeffrey Dahmer, has been found guilty of every count in the information. Next, I have the standard criminal instruction 605. I've made a couple of changes in terms of singular to plural because this is multiple counts. But I have stricken the last paragraph from 605 and inserted civil instruction 180, which is the civil instruction regarding a 5-6 verdict.
By that, you mean the last paragraph, that being just that last sentence?
That's right. It's a one-sentence paragraph.
Okay, thank you.
I felt it was better to give the more comprehensive instruction, which is readily available in our civil instruction. So, I've got 145 here, information not evidence. I don't know that it's particularly meaningful here, but if nobody wants it, I won't give it. I think instructions are better if they're shorter rather than longer. Does anybody want that? 140?
Well, you're gonna read all of it. You're gonna read it. Okay. No, you don't have to put that in.
147, improper questions. 150, stricken testimony. 157, remarks of counsel. 160, arguments of counsel. 190, weight of evidence. 195, jurors' knowledge. 640, which is the special instruction on expert witnesses in this type of a situation. And that includes some of the other materials that were asked for in terms of expert witness testimony. I have civil instruction 265, which is the expert witness hypothetical question. The substance of the instruction is the same as the criminal. I just like the wording a little bit better out of the civil, so that's why I selected that. 201 has been requested, opinion of non-expert witnesses. I assume what we're talking about is the several witnesses who were called to describe their contacts with Mr. Dahmer. Let me tell you how I've worded it in here. I've filled in a few blanks. There are, first, you have the general rule is that witnesses may testify only to facts known to them. There are exceptions to this rule, and in this case, several witnesses were allowed to give their opinion as to Jeffrey Dahmer's mental condition at the time they had contact with him. Now that's what I filled in, and then I pick up with the standard instruction. $215, objections of counsel and evidence received over objection. 300, credibility of witnesses. I think this is civil instruction 190, which is the closing.
Oh.
Civil 190. Here, let me read it so there's no doubt in your mind what I'm talking about. Now, members of the jury, this case is ready to be submitted to you for your serious deliberation. You will consider the case fairly, honestly, impartially, in the light of reason and common sense. Give each question in the verdict your careful and conscientious consideration. In answering each question, you will Free your minds from all feelings of sympathy, bias, or prejudice. Let your verdict speak the truth, whatever the truth may be. When you retire to the jury room, your first duty will be to elect a juror who will preside over your deliberations and write in the answers you have agreed upon. The vote of the presiding juror, however, is entitled to no greater weight than the vote of any other juror. When your deliberations are concluded and your answers inserted in the verdicts, the presiding juror will sign and date the verdicts, and all of you will return with the verdict into court. And the bailiffs are then sworn. That's and the reason I picked that is because this deals with a special verdict rather than the general verdict that we typically have in a criminal case.
Your Honor,
I was supposed to.
I'm sorry.
Okay, if we're talking about, that's what I have. If you fully understand what I have here, then let's go to Mr. Boyle and
I'll withdraw my request, if you have my list up there. If
I have your list here somewhere.
Yeah, I'll put it on the record. I withdraw the request for 101, note-taking permitted, 103, evidence to find, 155, exhibits, 162, decreed facts, 165, judicially noticed facts, 170, circumstantial evidence, 180, confessions, admissions, my 200 and 201A. I don't know what you want to do with that, Judge, because
We're giving them in another form.
Okay.
Those are wrapped into
I'll withdraw.
640.
I'll withdraw my 205, expert testimony, hypothetical question. I'll withdraw my 275. I'll withdraw 275-1. I will withdraw 315. That's defendant elects not to testify. I will withdraw 317. You've got your 460 in there, and 525 I'll withdraw. And I would like to read to you the special jury instruction that I have provided your clerk with. And I'd like to make my record now. I'll be brief.
Go ahead.
We've argued this before. Read, you have a number of alternatives in regards to the verdict you may return in this case. You may find that the defendant was sane when he committed each and every offense. You may find that the defendant was insane at the time of the commission of each and every offense. Or you may find that the defendant was insane at the time of the commission of some of the offenses and not others. That is your entitlement. If you find that the defendant was insane at the time of the commission of any one offense, he will be found not responsible for that offense, but will be committed to the Department of Health and Social Services and will be placed in an appropriate institution until the court determines that the defendant would not pose a danger to himself or to others if released under conditions ordered by the court. If you find that the defendant was sane at the time of the commission of any one offense, he would be sentenced as provided by law, which is mandatory life imprisonment on each and every count where you make such a finding. In case of a mixed verdict, sane on one or more and not responsible on one or more, the defendant would first be confined in a state mental hospital, and when released from there, he would be taken to the state prison to serve out the mandatory life sentence. However, in deciding whether the defendant is responsible for the criminal conduct, you are to consider only the issue of defendant's mental condition at the time of the offense was committed. You are given this instruction so as to make you aware of the effect of your decision, but you are determined the question presented you upon the instructions already given to you. I would ask the court to either give that or take it under advisement. I realize that the instruction says it's provided by law, but the case law says a jury should know what the effect of their decision is, and the reality of it is, as provided by law says nothing. It's a non-thing. And we do know that there is no discretion on what Mr. Dahmer will have to do if he is found to be guilty and sane. He will be caused to be served as a mandatory life imprisonment. And I think the jury should be entitled to know that. And I say that because one of the things that I was hopefully trying to accomplish in this case was at the very least to have Mr. Dahmer committed to the state institution until such time as he had complied with what the law required, and then to go and serve out his sentence in the hopes that there would be some study to help him get over what his obvious problem has been, and secondly, to give people a chance to do some research. So I'd ask that the court give that, and I think the jury's entitled to know that. Now, if the court says you can't give it, then I'm going to ask leave of the court tomorrow morning to suggest how I may be able to very carefully comply with the court's answer, but to let the jury know that they can use their common sense in what is provided by law means, and not be foreclosed by telling them what the instruction says. Thank you.
That's right.
Briefly on that, First of all, the state would object to that instruction. It phrases the issues in terms of sane and insane. This is a responsibility hearing. It also, unfortunately, focuses on disposition for the jury rather than the finding of responsibility, which they need to make. And I believe the instructions the court has already given are the standard instruction that do advise the jury that a finding of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect would commit him on that count to the supervision of the appropriate department. I think that is what they are required to know, and over-focusing on where he will be turns this from a responsibility case into a dispositional case, and essentially has the jury picking where they would most like him to be housed without having any expert knowledge on the facilities available and what is most appropriate. They haven't heard testimony on that. Beyond that, the state's only argument would be that we believe that the two jury instructions, 103, evidence defined, and I believe it's 105, agreed facts, would be appropriate since there were a number of stipulations in this case. Those are both brief, and I think one, the other, or both.
I've already given them agreed facts, but I did that during the course of trial, if you recall. And evidence defined.
Evidence defined just says that it's three different things, one of which is stipulations of the parties.
Let's see, I'm not sure if that was done at the... See, in a normal criminal trial, I do that at the beginning, and I'm not... And now my problem is recalling what I did at the beginning. I don't know, we can put that in. And if you really want agreed facts to be given to them again, sure. I could give.
I think if evidence defined is given, since it covers stipulations, that's
okay. Okay, that's what, 103, is it?
Yes.
Okay. That's it. Oh, let me... Okay, the only open question we have now is the matter of Mr. Boyle's request for his special instruction. Is that correct? The final part of the standard instruction says this: if you answer both of these questions yes, the defendant will be found to be not responsible for the offense, and he will be committed to the Department of Health and Social Services and will be placed in an appropriate institution unless the court determines that the defendant would not pose a danger to himself or others if released under conditions ordered by the court. In deciding whether the defendant is responsible for the criminal conduct, you are to consider only the issue of the defendant's mental condition at the time the offense was committed. Now, this language was adopted by the Instructions Committee in response to the case law that Mr. Boyle refers to. At the beginning of the trial, we reviewed that case law. And contained within that case law is the acknowledgement that telling juries what the effect of their decision is not the general rule. This is a special rule carved out of that. And for that reason, I think it's important that we limit that. And I think the proper interpretation of the case law is that we do what this instruction does, and that we tell them what happens in regard to their verdict in this case, but not go on to tell them what happens generally in terms of the criminal disposition of the case. So I'm relying on my colleagues that serve on the Criminal Instruction Committee, and because I believe they've considered this. In fact, I'm sure they have. And I find what they have come up with to be extremely persuasive, although I'm well aware that it's not controlling, Mr. Boyle. And that in any event is the court's position. You've indicated that you are going to spend the evening to come up with another suggestion as to how you might handle it. We'll deal with that in the morning, of course.
How kind are you going to be about what time we're starting up in the morning?
Well, first of all, I have to ask you gentlemen a question. How kind are you going to be to the patients of the court and jurors in terms of the length of your Closing statements, I think that I think we have to have limits. I want to listen to you as to what those limits should be, because limits are designed to be fair and not to try to impose undue hardship on either attorney. But I have to have some. I think I have to have some guidance. You're going to start out, Mr. Boyle. What do you think?
You know, Judge, over the years, I'm telling you, every time I talk, even in the long ones, I always look up and it's always about 55 minutes. But I think I should say an hour and a half. Yeah, I don't know about rebuttal.
What did we
Where the
say?
adversary
Here, I have a suggestion in mind, which is consistent with, I think, what you just said, and that is that each of you be allocated 2 hours. You have the right to divide your time as you choose fit.
That's good for me.
Live with that, Mr. McCann?
That's good.
Okay.
The court, if I ask for it, I can roll for 2 hours, but if I ask for a 3-minute break or something, I'm sure the court would give that to me.
And I won't.
Maybe the jury might need it too.
No, if you would like a break within your argument, please tell me, because I'm trying to be polite and not interrupt you. So that if you want a break, you're going to have to ask for it.
Well, if we take a break, we got to take a break after mine anyway.
Sure,
Take a break, and he goes. If he needs a break within a break, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And then I'm going to try and get it on back. I won't need a break after he talks. I'll try and get it over the phone.
Okay. What time you want to start tomorrow morning then, now that we've worked that one out?
About 9:30, Jay. That's 9:30, 10:30, 11 o'clock. He goes, no, that's not good. What time? 8:30. So.
We make it 9, we could.
Make it 9 o'clock. Why don't we make it 9 o'clock? Okay, we could.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Yes.
We'll see you tomorrow morning. Court's in recess.
Yes.